To our presentation on the design technique UML Sequence Diagrams. We would first like to begin by describing what the UML sequence diagram is and how it is used. Firstly, a UML sequence diagram is an illustration of relations or interactions between the objects in a sequential order. This is to mean the order of which the operations will take place in the project. Event diagrams and event scenarios are related to this technique as they are just simply the recording of the events in the order that it takes place. We create a diagram of these events as they happen and are able to analyze the response between each item as it gets passed along and each objective as a certain operation takes place. When using the UML sequence diagram, we identify 5 main things. First, we identify the actors, which is sometimes called the users. We identify lifelines, which can also be described as like function calls, functions in the program. The messages, and this includes all messages from function calls to reply messages or the return or many different kinds of messages in which can be used in the program to help it run. And lastly, we also identify guards or conditions in which the function will expect a certain response or a certain input from the user. As you can see, we created an example of a UML diagram with some concepts from our hack project. At the top of the diagram, we have the squares with student, hack, and the LMS system in it. Each of these represent an actor or a user in the grand scheme of the project. Next, we see the lines with the arrows, which represent each of the messages and the different kinds of messages there are. There's a line pointing from student to hack, which represents a message sent. There is a line on the hack under the load information, which is a self message. And then the call message for the retrieve information to the LMS, and the return message, the reply message, sent from the LMS back to the hack with the information. Each of the small rectangular squares on each of the lines represent a lifeline. This is to mean a function call. So when student calls hack to open the application, there's that function call. Then when it loads the information, there's another function call. The function call from the hack to the LMS is to retrieve the information, in which it simply returns information, which is why there's only a reply message from information. One other aspect of the sequence diagram that is not shown is when you want to have a condition listed, such as a student puts in a password and the password needs to be correct to log on to hack, you will create a line for a message and you will have an oval over that line with the condition that's in it, such as it seeks the correct password. If it is not correct, then the condition is not met for that message. One last thing to keep in mind when we do this diagram is that there will be many possibilities depending on what the original actor will choose to do on the program. And so with our project, we may or may not have to create many sequence diagrams to analyze different responses and different actions done by the student. That way it would be easier to read and analyze that information for us.
Hello, I'm Alexander Bloom, and I'm going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of 2 UML sequence diagrams. So the major benefit with Unified Modeling Language, or UML, is its ability to communicate ideas effectively. We are on the 2nd revision of UML, which is UML 2.0. UML contains several different types of diagrams, such as class and component diagrams. What makes UML powerful in general is that it is industry-wide. It is an industry-wide standard So when you create a UML sequence diagram, most engineers in the industry will understand what you are trying to say. Another huge benefit to UML sequence diagrams is that your specifications are related to a sequence. Software engineers are most concerned with two major aspects, which is information and how the information is processed. UML sequence diagrams deal specifically with how information is processed and what elements of the program interact with each other. A very good example of this is the picture to the left of the slide. It shows how a customer actor is sending a deposit to a bank. If the deposit is greater than 0, it means that the deposit is validated and therefore can be processed by the bank. UML diagrams are invaluable for documentation purposes because it enables engineers who need to perform maintenance or to improve the system to understand how the system moves and interacts, given certain scenarios. Lastly, diagrams and models give valuable insight into the logic driving the system, effectively giving you a bird's eye view where you can spot problems or inconsistencies. Most of the disadvantages of UML sequence diagrams are to do with complexity that they portray. If your system is complex with many calls and processes with many different actors, you can become lost. It can be lengthy and hard to draw connections if there are many moving parts. If there are many actors, it becomes extremely wide, many processes extremely horizontally long. The size can also make it more complicated if the program is too dynamic, in which the lines passing through every which way are complicated and hard to read. Most of the disadvantages are situational. You have to use diagrams appropriately. A sequence diagram is really only good for a general overview, showing how objects, aka actors, collaborate with each other. If your UML diagram involves more than one use case, it will not be effective at conveying your design. A use case is described as being a certain situation. Once again, going back to the bank transaction example, the use case in that particular diagram was the user depositing money into his account. A sequence diagram reflects an interaction and not necessarily every function a program can carry out. If you have different functions the program must do, you have to model those interactions in another sequence diagram. Here are some of our conclusions and recommendations. 1. A UML sequence diagram is the illustration of relations or interactions between objects in a sequential order. We could use it to analyze our possible usage patterns and expectations. 2. A lifeline is an internal participant in the sequence diagram. Our project could have many lifelines depending on the user's interaction. And 3. It seems that the disadvantages to this technique are situational to the project. This technique could be useful, many separate diagrams each for a pattern of the user. UML diagrams are a very useful tool for software engineers. Much like following a recipe for preparing food, UML sequence diagrams guide the engineer as to what logic must be prepared for the program to function. In a way, UML sequence diagrams are visual representations of pseudocode, but they are much more abstract and high level. They convey the idea of logic and communication applied between actors. It is up to the programmer to fill in the particular functions to those implications. To summarize what UML sequence diagrams are, it is an order and manner of how objects interact with each other given interactions or a scenario. These interactions are used by developers to document and understand requirements for new and existing systems.